Welcome back to Avoidant Decoded, where we don't just talk about relationships, we uncover the hidden patterns behind them. If you're ready to see emotional distance, silence, and connection from a deeper perspective, you're in the right place. And if you truly want to understand these dynamics on a whole new level, consider joining our membership, where we go even deeper into the psychology most people never talk about. One of the most difficult realizations for an avoidant person isn't the idea of losing someone. It's the moment they understand that the person they kept pushing away was never confused to begin with. That person wasn't blindly loyal or unaware. They were paying attention the entire time, quietly observing, allowing everything to unfold before deciding whether they should stay or leave for good. Avoidant individuals often move through relationships believing their emotional defenses go unnoticed. They assume the other person can't fully see the distancing, the inconsistency, or the emotional withdrawal happening beneath the surface. In their mind, if someone continues to stay patient, it must mean they don't truly understand what's going on. They mistake patience for a lack of awareness. They see compassion as weakness and interpret deep understanding as emotional dependence. Because of this belief, the avoidant convinces themselves that their behavior is too subtle to be clearly recognized. The hot and cold patterns, the sudden shutdowns after moments of closeness, the delayed responses, the selective affection, the way they pull someone in and then push them away again. They assume these patterns are confusing enough to keep the other person off balance. For a while, this illusion gives them a sense of control. They feel emotionally protected, as if they are managing the pace and direction of the relationship. They believe they can step back emotionally, return with warmth when it suits them, and then withdraw again without the full truth ever being seen. But eventually, that illusion begins to crack, and when it does, it shakes them in a way they don't expect. What unsettles them isn't just the idea that their partner noticed a few things. It's the realization that the partner saw everything from the very beginning, every inconsistency, every moment of distance, every emotional wall, every time they disguised withdrawal as independence. It was all noticed. While the avoidant thought they were maintaining control, the other person was quietly connecting the dots with clarity. They understood the pattern long before they ever spoke about it. And that realization hits much harder than anger or confrontation ever could, because it completely destroys the story the avoidant told themselves. Their silence was never mysterious. Their distance was never hidden. The mixed signals were clear. The pulling away after closeness was obvious. Even the fear beneath their detachment was visible, and the other person saw all of it. At some point, the avoidant starts to recognize something deeply uncomfortable. The calmness they once interpreted as confusion was actually awareness. The patience they thought meant weakness was really emotional strength. The silence they assumed meant blindness was actually observation. The person they underestimated was quietly gaining clarity the entire time. This is where things begin to shift internally. What once felt like control now starts to feel like exposure. Avoidant individuals spend years building emotional walls to protect themselves. They carefully manage closeness and vulnerability, creating just enough distance to feel safe while still keeping the other person emotionally engaged. As long as the other person continues chasing, the avoidant feels secure in that dynamic. But the moment they realize the other person wasn't chasing blindly, everything changes. The emotional balance flips. Suddenly, the avoidant feels seen, and being fully seen is one of their deepest fears. What makes it even more unsettling is understanding that the other person didn't just notice things in passing. They remembered everything. Every time closeness was followed by distance, every emotional shutdown after vulnerability, every broken promise, every retreat masked as needing space. It was all registered and understood. For someone who has relied on distance to avoid accountability, this realization becomes overwhelming. They begin replaying past moments in their mind, but now with a completely different perspective. Conversations they once brushed off start to feel significant. Times when the other person stayed calm instead of reacting emotionally now feel unsettling in hindsight. Slowly it becomes clear to them that the other person was never lost in the relationship. They were aware the entire time. And that awareness forces the avoidant to face something they have spent most of their life avoiding: accountability. Because once someone truly understands the pattern, the old strategies stop working. Silence no longer creates confusion. Distance no longer gives control. Mixed signals no longer create emotional dependence. You can't manipulate someone who already sees the cycle clearly. And this is often the moment when the avoidant begins to feel a real fear of losing that person. Not because something suddenly changed overnight, but because the illusion they were relying on is gone. The dynamic they felt safe in no longer exists, and for the first time, they are no longer in control of how things are perceived. Eventually, something happens that avoidant individuals rarely expect. The person they were used to keeping in the cycle stops participating in it. They are so accustomed to people chasing after distance that they unconsciously rely on it. They expect their silence to pull someone closer, not push them away. But over time, the emotionally aware partner reaches a limit. They stop explaining themselves over and over. They stop chasing. They stop trying to create closeness where there is no consistency to support it. And when that shift happens, the avoidant feels a kind of emotional discomfort they don't quite know how to handle. For the first time, they are left alone with the consequences of their own behavior. In that space, something begins to change. They start seeing the relationship from the other person's perspective. They realize the partner didn't stay because they were unaware or lacking clarity. They stayed because they were trying to understand the full truth before making a final decision. They were paying attention to actions, not just words, watching closely to see if the inconsistency would pass or if it revealed something deeper about the avoidant's emotional limitations. That kind of patience takes real strength. And once the avoidant recognizes that strength, it becomes difficult to ignore. They begin to understand that they underestimated the emotional intelligence of the person they kept at a distance. Because emotionally aware people don't always react right away. Sometimes they observe first. Sometimes they remain quiet while they gather clarity. Sometimes they allow patterns to unfold naturally instead of confronting them too early. And by the time they finally detach, they are usually certain about why. This is where the dynamic shifts completely. The avoidant starts to realize that the other person is no longer caught in confusion. They see the behavior clearly now. They understand the pattern completely. In many cases, they can even predict what the avoidant will do next before it happens. And that predictability takes away the avoidant's sense of control. When control fades, a feeling of exposure takes its place. Internally, the avoidant may begin to feel discomfort, regret, guilt, and vulnerability all at once. Even if they never say it out loud, they feel the weight of being understood too clearly. Their usual defenses no longer work the way they once did. The truth has already been seen. And once someone truly sees the pattern, there's no going back to the illusion that existed before. That's when a deeper realization begins to surface. The person they underestimated was never unaware. They were simply patient enough to let the truth reveal itself over time. And for the first time, the avoidant starts to recognize something they've avoided for years. The one who seemed most vulnerable in the relationship wasn't actually the partner. It was them. That awareness can change an avoidant in powerful ways, even if they don't openly admit it. For some, it becomes the beginning of self-reflection. They start to see how their fear of intimacy slowly damaged a connection that may have been safe. They begin to understand how often they created distance where genuine connection was trying to grow. The person they doubted wasn't the real threat. Their own fear was. But not everyone responds with growth. For some avoidants, that realization feels too heavy. Instead of facing it, they retreat even further into emotional distance. Accountability is something they've spent years avoiding, and confronting it can feel overwhelming. Still, one truth doesn't change. The partner saw everything. Every inconsistency, every emotional withdrawal, every shift into coldness, every disappearance disguised as independence. They understood the pattern long before the avoidant ever did, and even with that awareness, they stayed long enough to fully understand what they were dealing with. What the avoidant is rarely prepared for is the moment that person finally lets go for real. That's when everything shifts internally. Losing someone who truly saw their potential hits differently. It's not just the loss itself, it's the realization that they played a role in it. And that realization doesn't just disappear, it lingers. Quiet moments bring back old conversations. Situations they once dismissed start to carry new meaning. They begin revisiting memories, but now through the other person's perspective. What they once saw as acceptance is revealed as something else entirely. It wasn't blindness, it was observation. Careful, patient, emotionally intelligent observation. The partner wasn't emotionally lost, they were collecting clarity. Every pattern, every inconsistency, every shift contributed to a bigger picture that eventually became impossible to ignore. What looked like patience was actually evaluation, and this is where the emotional weight deepens even more. The avoidant begins to realize they were never as unreadable as they believed. They weren't mysterious or hidden. Their behavior was constantly revealing the truth. Every withdrawal, every shutdown, every inconsistency, it was all visible. It was simply processed quietly instead of reacted to immediately. Emotionally intelligent people don't always walk away at the first sign of trouble. Sometimes they stay long enough to confirm what's real. They don't judge based on isolated moments. They watch patterns. They ask themselves deeper questions. Can this person handle closeness without pulling away? Can they stay emotionally present? Can they offer stability instead of confusion? The avoidant often realizes too late that these questions were being answered in silence the entire time. And the answer becomes undeniable when the partner changes. When they stop chasing. When they stop explaining. When their energy shifts from pursuit to detachment. That's when the avoidant finally understands something they underestimated. The patience of someone who knows their worth has a limit. The partner was never waiting blindly. They were studying the reality of the relationship. Every mixed signal, every broken promise, every moment of distance added to a quiet mental record that eventually shaped their decision. And that truth disrupts the avoidant's self-image, because they believed they were hidden. But silence doesn't erase behavior. Distance doesn't erase patterns. And calmness doesn't mean confusion. The partner had been putting everything together from the very beginning, not out of dependency, but out of self-protection. They were deciding whether the relationship was emotionally safe enough to continue investing in, and that becomes the hardest realization of all. They were never trying to force love. They were waiting for consistency, waiting for accountability, waiting for emotional responsibility. But instead, they were met with repeated cycles of closeness and distance, connection and disappearance, warmth followed by emotional shutdown. What the avoidant thought was subtle, the other person saw as clear evidence. At some point, the emotional weight becomes too heavy for one person to carry alone. And this is where the avoidant is forced to face a truth they have been avoiding for a long time. The very distance that once made them feel safe slowly became the reason everything fell apart. The silence they relied on for control created disconnection. The walls they built to protect themselves also blocked the love they wanted to receive. What unsettles them the most is realizing that the person they once saw as emotionally dependent was actually the stronger one all along. Strong enough to stay present without losing awareness. Strong enough to care without lowering their standards. Strong enough to recognize patterns without turning everything into conflict. And most importantly, strong enough to walk away when the connection no longer felt emotionally safe. This is where the final shift happens. For a long time, the avoidant believed distance meant power, but when the other person leaves calmly, without chaos or drama, something changes. They begin to understand that real emotional strength isn't in pulling away, it's in knowing when to let go with clarity. The silence at the end isn't confusion, it's closure. The withdrawal isn't weakness, it's self-respect. And leaving isn't emotional collapse, it's acceptance. By the time this becomes clear, the relationship is already over. Because once someone truly sees that their needs won't be met, they don't keep explaining themselves. They don't chase. They don't hold on to hope that keeps getting broken. They simply choose to leave. And that's the part the avoidant struggles to sit with afterward. The person they kept pushing away was never unaware. They saw everything from the very beginning. They were simply kind. And that kindness wasn't weakness. It was patience, intentional, measured patience that allowed the truth to reveal itself naturally. When that truth became undeniable, they left with a calm and steady heart. Not suddenly, but after fully understanding what they were dealing with. For the avoidant, this realization doesn't hit all at once. It builds over time. In quiet moments, memories start to resurface. Conversations they once dismissed begin to feel important. Situations they overlooked begin to carry meaning. Slowly, They begin to see that the calmness, the patience, and the steady presence of their partner were never signs of desperation. They were signs of strength, strength that was completely misunderstood at the time. What they once labeled as someone being too attached or too forgiving was actually someone with enough clarity to observe everything without rushing to conclusions. Their partner didn't stay because they couldn't leave. They stayed because they chose to understand first. They wanted to see whether what they were experiencing was temporary or part of a deeper pattern that wouldn't change. That difference mattered more than anything. The avoidant begins to realize that what looked like tolerance was actually awareness. Nothing was being ignored. The distance, the emotional withdrawal, the sudden coldness after closeness, it was all noticed. It just wasn't reacted to immediately, because the goal wasn't reaction, it was understanding. And that realization feels heavy, because they start to see that they were being understood more clearly than they ever understood themselves in that situation. Their partner wasn't confused. They weren't lost. They weren't hoping blindly. They were watching patterns form over time, quietly separating temporary emotions from consistent behavior. This leads to another uncomfortable truth. The silence they once took as agreement or acceptance was neither. It was space. Space that allowed reality to reveal itself without interference. While the avoidant believed silence meant everything was fine, it actually meant, I'm paying attention. While they thought patience meant dependence, it actually reflected discernment. And what they saw as emotional softness was actually discipline. That misunderstanding changes everything when seen clearly, because it reframes the entire relationship. The partner wasn't reacting to every moment. They were observing whether consistency would show up on its own. They weren't forcing change. They were watching if change was real. And when it didn't come, the answer became clear. This is where it becomes painful, because the avoidant realizes that what they thought was still being accepted was actually being evaluated the entire time. Every cycle of closeness followed by distance, every broken emotional rhythm, every moment of pulling away after connection, it was all being mentally noted. Not to judge, but to understand. And once that understanding was complete, the decision didn't need noise. It didn't need arguments or emotional outbursts. It only needed certainty. That's when the avoidant sees something they didn't expect. Their partner wasn't emotionally dependent. They were grounded. They didn't stay because they were unable to leave. They stayed long enough to be sure that leaving was the right choice. That difference changes everything, because it shows that patience wasn't a lack of boundaries. It was boundaries in action. Quiet, steady boundaries that didn't need constant explanation. Over time, as those boundaries were crossed again and again through repeated patterns, the conclusion formed naturally, not through anger or chaos, but through clarity. The avoidant also begins to understand that their sense of control was never real. They believed distance gave them power. They believed unpredictability created leverage. They believed pulling away kept them safe. But in reality, those same behaviors revealed the pattern faster to someone who was paying attention. Every time they withdrew, it added to the picture. Every inconsistency became evidence. Every emotional shutdown added another piece of understanding. And slowly, that picture became complete. The difference is, the avoidant was inside the behavior, while their partner was outside observing it. And that difference in perspective made all the difference. The most humbling realization comes later. The partner was never waiting forever for potential. They were comparing potential with reality. And when reality kept repeating the same patterns, potential stopped being enough. At that point, leaving wasn't an emotional reaction. It was the natural outcome of everything that had been observed. It didn't require arguments. It didn't need a dramatic ending. It was simply clarity reaching its limit. And once clarity reaches that point, staying no longer makes sense. The avoidant is left with a realization that often comes too late to change anything. The person they believed would always stay was never unaware. They were patient enough to fully understand what was happening before deciding what to do about it. And when they finally walked away, it wasn't because they suddenly stopped caring. It was because they understood clearly enough to stop confusing care with self-abandonment. That's what stays with the avoidant afterward. Not just the absence of the person, but the understanding that the absence was chosen with full awareness. That's why the silence at the end feels so complete. It isn't emptiness, it's a conclusion. In the end, The truth is simple, even if it's difficult to accept. The relationship didn't end because the partner was weak, confused, or dependent. It ended because they were clear, quietly clear, consistently clear. That clarity wasn't built through reaction. It was built through observation, through awareness, through emotional intelligence. They didn't stay blindly. They stayed consciously. They stayed while paying attention. They stayed while learning whether consistency, emotional presence, and stability would ever truly show up. And every pattern gave them their answer. Every moment of distance after closeness, every emotional shutdown, every mixed signal, every repeated cycle that never changed, it all added up. Not as isolated events, but as proof of a deeper pattern that remained the same. The avoidant believed they were protecting themselves by staying distant. They believed they were maintaining control by not fully opening up. They believed inconsistency created mystery, and mystery created power. But in reality, those same behaviors created clarity for the person who was watching closely. Because emotional intelligence doesn't need constant confrontation to understand the truth. It doesn't need repeated conflict to see patterns. It doesn't need chaos to reach a conclusion. It simply observes, understands, and decides. And once that decision is made from a place of clarity, it becomes final. That's the part the avoidant struggles with the most. Not just that the relationship ended, but that it ended without confusion on the other side. The partner didn't leave because of one overwhelming moment. They left because they had already understood everything long before they walked away. Their patience was never passive. It was awareness combined with self-respect. They weren't hoping endlessly for change. They were quietly testing whether change was real. And when it wasn't, they didn't force it. They accepted it. That acceptance is what makes the ending so powerful, because it wasn't driven by anger, revenge, or emotional breakdown. It was driven by clarity. And clarity doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It simply ends what no longer aligns. For the avoidant, this becomes a mirror they can't avoid. They begin to see that what they thought was control was actually avoidance. What they thought was safety was distance. What they thought was independence was disconnection. And what they believed went unnoticed was fully seen, fully understood, and fully remembered. Every pattern was observed, not to be used against them, but to decide whether the relationship had a future. And eventually, the answer became clear. No amount of care could replace consistency. No amount of patience could replace emotional presence. No amount of potential could override repeated patterns that never changed. So the partner made a choice rooted in self-respect. They stopped investing where emotional safety couldn't exist. And that's the final truth the avoidant is left with. The person they thought would never leave was never staying out of blindness. They were staying out of patience. And when that patience reached its limit, they left with understanding, not confusion. That quiet, certain departure is what echoes the most, not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. And within that finality is the deepest lesson of all. Love isn't proven by how long someone stays while being hurt. It's proven by whether both people can remain present, consistent, and emotionally safe with each other. When that balance is broken again and again, even the most patient person will eventually choose peace over potential. And once that choice is made with full clarity, there's nothing left to question. Only the silence of an ending that was understood long before it ever arrived. The greatest truth the avoidant faces is not the loss of the relationship, but the realization of their own patterns within it. The distance that once felt like protection became the very thing that destroyed connection, while the quiet strength they overlooked was the foundation they truly needed. By the time clarity arrives, the person who understood everything has already walked away with peace. What remains is not confusion, but reflection, and the undeniable awareness that love was never the problem. Fear was.